I'm Jim Freeze. I'm the CEO of Rx360. I've been at Rx360 now for almost 6 years, and it's been wonderful. I always say it's been wonderful to watch Rx360 grow over the last 5 or 6 years. But what I've actually changed that to a little bit is watching the industry grow over the last 5 to 6 years, especially when it comes to this idea of supply chain integrity. I think it really on a daily basis moves at warp speed. And I give the industry a tremendous amount of credit for kind of trying to stay one step ahead of what's next. And I think that's really important. And that's kind of a theme that I'll kind of touch on as we go through the slides, and then as well as answer any questions. When we look at pharmaceutical supply chain integrity, and we'll get into a little bit here, but a lot of people, I think, sometimes make the mistake of intertwining the term integrity and the term security. And they can be very, very, clearly two different things. When I look at security is as well as integrity, but for the sake of this discussion, integrity is, to me, I think it took on an upgraded definition during the pandemic. Because what happened was almost overnight, we got incredibly concerned about supplier quality, whether it was because of real-time oversight, whether it was because of access into facilities, general worry regarding the supply chain. A lot of things came up during that time period that it became an acute sense of urgency. And it was wonderful to watch the industry work together as a whole. And again, we'll get into some of this during my slides. But when I look at the idea of integrity on a daily basis, when it comes to the pharma world, I kind of break it down into different sectors, whether it is security, getting a shipment of medicines from point A to point B. There can be a lot of security issues, especially when you looked at things like counterfeiting, diversion, last mile theft. A lot of those things really not only exist on a daily basis, but for one of the terms that people use with me all the time is the bad guys are constantly getting better, and we have to stay one step ahead of them. And that's where kind of logistics comes in. How do we get from point A to point B? That's part of the integrity pathway. The thing that we've always talked about for years and years and continue to do so is actually the quality and the quality of the materials. The reason I have quality and materials kind of separated out in a couple bullet points here is for two reasons. Number one, there is the material quality, which is incredibly important, obviously. But then there's also the quality of the process. How are our medicines being made? Not what they're being made with, but how they are. And I think that's when you get into a lot of the supplier auditing. Is we're looking at both the material quality as well as the process. So that's how I kind of break down the idea of integrity when it comes to the pharma supply chain. And there's one common theme here before we get into the next slide that I really want to kind of bang home, and that's really the idea of patient safety. Everything that we do when it comes to quality and supply chain in the pharma world has to do, it begins and ends with patient safety. So again, that's a theme that I want everybody to keep in mind as we go through these slides. So I mentioned before the pandemic and maybe the redefining of integrity. The world really did change. I mean, overnight, we went to this heightened sense of urgency of how are we going to, audit? How are we going to do X? How are we going to do Y? One of the great stories I tell all the time is the idea of remote auditing. Remote auditing was something that when we think about supply chain integrity in the pharma world, it's been around for a long time, but maybe it was never plan A. And the pandemic hit and it immediately became plan A. Maybe previously it was a plan C or a plan D. But I can remember at least here in the United States, the day after the quote quarantine started, my phone just buzzing every 2 minutes. How are we going to manage these audits? How are we going to work with our suppliers to ensure that everything's safe for the patients? I have this audit scheduled next week. What do I do? And one of the really great things that I witnessed firsthand, and again, this goes back to one of my earlier comments about, really watching the industry work together during the pandemic, is I watched 15 to 20 Rx360 members over the course of 72 hours, literally, for lack of a better term, burn the midnight oil and really redefining the audit program or audit checklist that's wrapped around remote auditing and how it was done and what were the steps to the puzzle and how do we kind of cross that chasm from what we're used to on-site auditing to remote auditing. And it needed to be done. It needed to be done fast, and it was done. And I watched the industry pivot very quickly to remote auditing, and I don't think we missed a beat. I mean, I think the quality of materials and the quality of the process to make our medicines didn't change. And as a matter of fact, I think, I used this term before when I've talked about some of the things I saw during the pandemic, but I think the industry as a whole went into an idea of hyper focus. And it was really, for me, it was incredibly humbling to watch that. And the good thing about it is that I think the lessons that we learned during that time period of being hyper focused around quality haven't left us. And it's amazing how many new best practices came out of the pandemic that people still institute today. So again, I just wanted to touch on, not taking anything for granted, making sure that we're constantly in that best practice mode. And I think that's where supply chain integrity is really important. So one of the things I like to talk to people about, so sometimes when we look at supply chain integrity, we look at it as almost this very simple mindset, because everybody might have their own definition. I mean, you saw in my first slide, I had listed 4 bullet points. In reality, it's a lot more than that. And one of the things I try to explain to people is that there are so many different touch points that are at risk if we don't pay attention to supply chain integrity in the pharma world. I stole this graphic from a previous presentation, but I think this gives a really, really good pictorial vision, whatever you want to say, about everything in the supply chain that can be at risk if we don't stay focused and are constantly evolving as an industry. One of the things I do love about this, though, is that it does recognize the end game is the patients. And I never want to lose sight of that, because that's ultimately why we do what we do. But it is amazing to me when you really start to break down all the elements of the supply chain, how many things we have to have diligent oversight on and not to be complacent about. That's the one thing that will really ultimately hurt I believe the quality of medicines around the world, is if we aren't diligent and we aren't paying attention. And I applaud pharma companies around the world to, whether they have supply chain security departments, whether they have brand protection departments, the continuing evolution of quality departments and procurement departments. They are paying attention. And I think sometimes in the public sector, pharma companies don't get the due that they deserve for the amount of time, energy, and money that they expense to making sure that the patient is safe and the materials that we use are top notch, and the processes that we use are top notch.
Jim, do you mind if I ask a question about this graphic? Where do you have a feel for where issues tend to get introduced in the supply chain? Like, are there certain links in the supply chain which are easier to protect than others?
Great question. I'm going to actually say we should be hyper focused around all of these. Depends on who you talk to. I mean, if you talk to a supply chain security expert, they might tell you that the wholesalers and distributors are where they have to pay attention to a lot. But if you talk to other people, I mean, they're going to talk in terms of maybe it's after the wholesaler and distributor, touch point. Maybe it's when you get to the physician's office or the retail pharmacy and those type of things. But I think it depends a lot, Luke, on who you talk to. Now, I would tell you that what I have seen in the 6 years that I've been at Rx360 is, do we have to be diligent across all spectrums? Yes. But one of the things that I've really kind of learned from our membership here at Rx360 is if we pay attention to the security and logistics aspect, how to get medicines from point A to point B, that's incredibly important. Making sure that we're paying attention to brand protection and counterfeiting issues, incredibly important. And then obviously one of the things that the industry as a whole is always thinking about is how do we audit our suppliers, making sure that those materials are what we need, that they're being processed correctly and those type of things. So long answer, keeping it short, it's all of them to me are equal. But I think if we're hyper-focused in maybe those three areas that we mentioned, we can get 90% of the issues taken care of.
Great, thank you.
So I mentioned before that at the beginning of the pandemic, and we started to go into this model of being hyper-focused and this model of, oh no, what do I do? And getting people together to streamline how do we do remote audits for everybody, whether they're a tier 1 supplier or a tier 4 supplier. And what I started doing on day one, which I thought was really interesting, was I started keeping a little log of who was calling me and where I was getting phone calls from and where we needed to pay attention. And ultimately put it on a map because I really did want to see, hey, where are these pandemic related quality issues when it comes to supply chain integrity that in the first 72 hours my phone rang from. So it was interesting to go through that exercise. And one of the neat things that I see is even post the pandemic, and even if you want to go before the pandemic, I'll bet you if you took a map and put the pins in it like you do, that this map probably wouldn't be too much different. So what that tells me is that nobody took the pandemic quality and supply chain integrity for granted when the quarantine hit, because probably the same places that we work on daily were the places that reached out to us. So that was a good sign and continues to be a good sign. So I mentioned at the very beginning that, sometimes people get integrity and security, I don't want to say mixed up, but maybe, kind of looked at the same way. There actually is a formal definition of supply chain integrity and security. And there's a lot of people that work within this model. There are other people that work where they're separated. And I think I can see where the rationale is to keep them separated. And the top things, again, that I really want to reference to everybody is where should we pay attention when it comes to integrity? It's counterfeiting and diversion. I mentioned before about staying one step ahead of the bad guy. That's not just an analogy. It is amazing to me the lengths that people go through to counterfeit medicines, to steal shipments, to divert shipments. It is a never-ending problem. And I don't want to say we're always behind the 8 ball, because I think the pharma industry does a great job of protecting medicines against counterfeiting and diversion, but it's a yeoman's job to stay one step ahead, and that's where the challenge is. So it's something that we should be acutely aware of. One of the great stories that I hear all the time is, a pharmacist working for a local pharmacy here in the United States got a delivery of medicines from a courier and looked at the return address label on the box and realized it didn't seem correct, didn't seem right. And so he called local authorities. He called the company that he ordered the material from, and turns out it was a box of counterfeit medicines. And so it's really neat to see people across the spectrum pay attention to these things, because I think it really does cut down and mitigate the risk of the patients being harmed. Material quality. This is kind of an area that I can't say it enough. I know I've said it already why we've been talking here, but the pharmaceutical industry does not get enough credit for the amount of work that they do in making sure that the quality of materials that are being used are what keeps our patients safe, what keeps our medicines active, what keeps them working. That's one thing that really truly has amazed me and continues to amaze me on a daily basis working with this community. So material quality is important. Transportation, we talked about getting shipments from point A to point B. We just talked about diversion. Again, it's humbling to me to see some of the logistics and transportation companies out there that help us get medicines from point A to point B, taking the time to understand the importance of delivering a pharmaceutical product, taking the time to understand that part of the supply chain integrity is the temperature of the trucks, leaving something on an airport tarmac. How is it protected? Those are the lengths that I think, again, people don't always think about, but it all comes into play when we talk about the integrity of supply chain. So, again, like, I applaud pharmaceutical companies for the efforts that they take in material quality. I really applaud the transportation and logistics folks that are out there. They are making a difference every day in patient safety. The last couple of things I wanted to mention was, we can never lose sight of how we are adapting. This world of supply chain integrity changes every day. The minute that we start thinking that today is going to be the same as tomorrow and vice versa, is when we lose track of how we're protecting patients. And supply chain integrity is constantly changing. So, I implore the industry constantly to stay one step ahead of the game, constantly look at internal best practices, share information amongst each other. One of the humbling things I see here at Rx360 is our members getting together and sharing best practices, ideas. In some cases they're competitors, but when you watch them share ideas, that they have their heart and their minds in the right place. And also, when it comes to supply chain integrity, let's not lose sight around sustainability. Let's not lose sight around making sure that the supply chain is filled, that we have backup plans in case a pandemic happens again. We don't want to be stuck with one supplier. We want to make sure that we're constantly having kind of the solutions to problems that may arise. So I think sustainability has also become incredibly important. And again, it's not where it's important because, oh no, what are we going to do about it? It's important because I sit back in my chair and I see that the industry has taken the sustainability around supply chain and put it to the forefront and making sure that they're on top of it. So, again, those are the things that I think about on a daily basis when it comes to integrity and the pharmaceutical supply chain. Don't go backwards. Make sure we always stay one step ahead. And then I always tell everybody too, is don't be the flavor of the day. I think what happens a lot when we're dealing with supply chain integrity when it comes to pharma products, there's always like something that's happening on a daily basis where it becomes the flavor of the day. And we dump all of our resources into that area. And, and then when we do that, we might forget about area B, C, and D. Don't be flavor of the day. Make sure that we're looking at everything constantly and paying attention to all the spokes in the wheel, so to say. Ask questions. Don't be scared to ask a peer, hey, how do you handle this? Don't be scared to ask questions of experts in the industry. There are so many resources out there to get help if you have questions or a challenge that you're dealing with internally. Don't lose that hyper-focus mentality. Don't relax. Stay ahead of the ball game. And then there's one thing two things actually I want to leave everybody with is I think sometimes, not sometimes, I would even venture to say all the time, we get so caught up in what we're doing on a daily basis within the pharmaceutical industry that we forget to actually give ourselves credit. You take that person that on a daily basis is managing CAPAs that came out of an audit. I mean, that person's incredibly valuable to the integrity of the supply chain, and they need to pat themselves on the back. We need to pat them on the back and let them know that they're doing a good job. And then the last thing I think, which is not only something that Rx360, we live by on a daily basis. I know you at PharmaSource lives by this on a daily basis, but it's industry togetherness. And we as an industry, if we can stay diligent, we're going to make sure that absolutely every patient that has access to a medicine is going to be protected, that medicine's going to be safe. Patients, their risk is mitigated, their worry is mitigated. So again, I applaud everybody that's worked towards making medicine safe, that the supply chain and the integrity of the supply chain is in place, and it's kind of what I live by on a daily basis, but it's nice to see other people really kind of driving the train, and it's exciting. It's exciting every day.